ASMR readings. Our latest book, which we have fully finished, is the Communist Manifesto. Today we are picking up with a new reading. Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. Is there no alternative? It's a pretty short book. Very renowned in the leftist sphere. We will be reading this one 2 chapters at a time, just to speed up the process. So let's get started. Before I forget, first of all, you might hear some tummy rumblings. I need to get some food after this, so apologies in advance. And second of all, I wanted to thank everyone who's been supporting me since the start of this new venture. And if you would like to support me in continuing doing this, don't forget to like and subscribe, so that we can get new books going and continue this series of ASMR readings, leftist ASMR readings, most importantly. So let's get started. Chapter 1. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. In one of the key scenes in Alfonso Cuarón 2006 film Children of Man, Clive Owen's character, Theo, visits a friend at Battersea Power Station, which is now some combination of government building and private collection. Cultural treasures, Michelangelo's David, Picasso's Guernica, Pink Floyd's Inflatable Pig, are preserved in a building that is itself a refurbished heritage artifact. This is our only glimpse into the lives of the elite, holed up against the effects of a catastrophe which has caused mass sterility. No children have been born for a generation. Theo asks the question, how all this can matter if there will be no one to see it? The alibi can no longer be future generations, since there will be no one. The response is nihilistic hedonism. I try not to think about it. What is unique about the dystopia in Children of Man is that it is specific to late capitalism. This isn't the familiar totalitarian scenario routinely trotted out in cinematic dystopias. See, for example, James McTeague's 2005 V for Vendetta. In the P.D. James novel on which the film is based, democracy is suspended and the country is rolled over by a self-appointed warden, but wisely, the film downplays all this. For all that we know, the authoritarian measures that are everywhere in place could have been implemented within a political structure that remains, notionally, democratic. The war on terror has prepared us for such a development. The normalization of crisis produces a situation in which the repealing of measures brought in to deal with an emergency becomes unimaginable. When will the war be over? Watching Children of Man, we are inevitably reminded of the phrase attributed to Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek. That it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. This slogan captures precisely what I mean by capitalist realism, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. Once, dystopian films and novels were exercised in such acts of imagination. The disaster they depicted acting as narrative pretext for the emergence of different ways of living. Not so in Children of Man. The world that it projects seems more like an extrapolation or exacerbation of ours than an alternative to it. In its world, as in ours, ultra-authoritarianism and capital are by no means incompatible. Internment camps and franchise coffee bars coexist. In Children of Man, public space is a especially resonant scene takes place inside the derelict school through which a deer runs. Neoliberals, the capitalist realists par excellence, have celebrated the destruction of public space, but, contrary to their official hopes, there is no withering away of the state in Children of Man, only a stripping back of the state to its core military and police functions. I say official hopes, since neoliberalism surreptitiously relied on the state, even while it has ideologically excoriated it. This was made spectacularly clear during the banking crisis of 2008, when, at the invitation of neoliberal ideologues, the state rushed in to shore up the banking system. The catastrophe in Children of Man is neither waiting down the road, nor has it already happened. Rather, it is being lived through. There is no punctual moment of disaster. The world doesn't end with a bang. It winks out, unravels, gradually falls apart. What caused the catastrophe to occur, who knows? Its cause lies long in the past, so absolutely detached from the present as to seem like the caprice of a malign being, a negative miracle, a malediction which no penitence can ameliorate. Such a blight can only be eased by an intervention that can no more be anticipated than was the onset of the course in the first place. Curse in the first place. Action is pointless, only senseless hope makes sense. Superstition and religion, the first resorts of the helpless, proliferate. But what of the catastrophe itself? It is evident that the theme of sterility must be read metaphorically as the displacement of another kind of anxiety. I want to argue this anxiety cries out to be read in cultural terms, and the question of the film poses is, how long can a culture persist without the new? What happens if the young are no longer capable of producing surprises? Children of Man connects with the suspicion that the end has already come, the thought that it could well be the case that the future harbors only reiteration and repermutation. Could it be that there are no breaks, no shocks of the new to come? Such anxiety tends to result in a bipolar oscillation. The weak messianic hope that there must be something new on the way lapses into the morose conviction that nothing new can ever happen. The focus shifts from the next big thing to the last big thing. How long ago did it happen, and just how big was it? T.S. Eliot looms in the background of Children of Man, which after all inherits the theme of sterility from the wasteland. The film's closing epigraph, Shanti, 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 has no more to do with Eliot's fragmentary pieces than the Upanishad's piece. Perhaps it is possible to see the concerns of another Eliot, the Eliot of tradition and the individual talent, ciphered in Children of Man. It was in this essay that Eliot, in anticipation of Harold Bloom, described the reciprocal relationship between the canonical and the new. The new defines itself in response to what is already established. At the same time, the established has to reconfigure itself in response to the new. Eliot's claim was that the exhaustion of the future does not even leave us with the past. Tradition counts for nothing when it is no longer contested and modified. A culture that is merely preserved is no culture at all. The fate of Picasso's Guernica in the film, once a howl of anguish and outrage against fascist atrocity, now a wall hanging, is exemplary. Like its Battersea hanging space in the film, the painting is accorded iconic status only when it's deprived of any possible function or context. No cultural object can retain its power when there are no longer new eyes to see it. We do not need to wait for Children of Man's near future to arrive to see this transformation of culture into museum pieces. The power of capitalist realism derives in part from the way that capitalism subsumes and consumes all of previous history. One effect of its system of equivalence, which can assign all cultural objects, whether they are religious iconography, pornography, or Das Kapital, a monetary value. Walk around the British Museum, where you see see objects torn from their life worth and assembled as if on the deck of some predator spacecraft, and you have a powerful image of this process at work. In the conversion of practices and rituals into merely aesthetic objects, the beliefs of previous cultures and are objectively ironized, transformed into artifacts. Capitalist realism is therefore not a particular type of realism, it is more like realism in itself. As Marx and Engels themselves observed in the Communist Manifesto, capital has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom, free trade. In one word, for exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusion, it has substituted taken, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. Once again, if you would like to hear the Communist Manifesto in ASMR reading, you should find a link showing up here above that has the entirety of it. Capitalism is what is left when beliefs have collapsed at the level of ritual or symbolic elaboration, and all that is left is the consumer spectator trudging through the ruins and the relics. Yet, this turn from belief to aesthetics, from engagement to spectatorship, is held to be one of the virtues of capitalist realism. In claiming, as Badiou puts it, to have delivered us from the fatal abstraction inspired by the ideologies of the past, capitalist realism presents itself as a shield protecting us from the perils posed by belief itself. The attitude of ironic distance proper to postmodern capitalism is supposed to immunize us against the seduction of fanaticism. Lowering our expectations, we are told, is a small price to pay for being protected from terror and totalitarianism. We live in a contradiction, Badiou has observed. A brutal state of affairs, profoundly inegalitarian, where all existence is evaluated in terms of money alone, is presented to us as ideal. To justify their conservatism, the partisans of the established order cannot really call it ideal or wonderful, so instead they have decided to say that all the rest is horrible. Sure, they say, we may not live in a condition of perfect goodness, but we're lucky that we don't live in a condition of evil. Our democracy is not perfect, but it's better than the bloody dictatorship. Capitalism is unjust, but it's not criminal like Stalinism. We let millions of Africans die of AIDS, but we don't make racist nationalist declarations like Milosevic. We kill Iraqis with our airplanes, but we don't cut throats with machetes like they do in Rwanda, etc. The realism here is analogous to the deflation perspective of a depressive who believes that any positive state, any hope, is a dangerous illusion. In their account of capitalism, surely the most impressive since Marx, Deleuze and Guattari describe capitalism as a kind of dark potentiality which haunted all previous social systems. Capital, they argue, is the unnameable thing, the abomination, which primitive and feudal society warded off in advance. When it actually arrives, capital seemed as if the territorializing impulses of capitalism have been confined to finance, leaving culture presided over by the forces of reterritorialization. This malaise, the feeling that there is nothing new, is itself nothing new, of course. We found ourselves at the notorious end of history, trumpeted by Francis Fukuyama after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Fukuyama's thesis that history has climaxed with liberal capitalism may have been widely derided, but it is accepted, even assumed, at the level of the cultural unconscious. It should be remembered, though, that even when Fukuyama advanced it, the idea that history had reached a terminal beach was not merely triumphalist. Fukuyama warned that his radiant city would be haunted, but he thought its specters would be Nietzschean rather than Marxian. Some of Nietzsche's most prescient pages are those in which he describes the oversaturation of an age with history. It leads an age into a dangerous mode of irony in regard to itself, he wrote in Untimely Meditation, and subsequently into the even more dangerous mode of cynicism, in which cosmopolitan fingering, a detached spectatorialism, replaces engagement and involvement. This is the condition of Nietzsche's last man, who has seen everything but is decadently enfeebled precisely by this excess of self-awareness. Fukuyama's position is in some ways a mirror image of Frederick Jameson's. Jameson famously claimed that postmodernism is the cultural logic of late capitalism. He argued that the failure of the future was constitutive of a postmodern cultural scene, as he correctly prophesied, would become dominated by pastiche and revivalism. Given that Jameson has made a convincing case for the relationship between postmodern culture and certain tendencies in consumer or post-Fordist capitalism, it could appear that there is no need for the concept of capitalist realism at all. In some ways, this is true. What I'm calling capitalist realism can be subsumed under the rubric of postmodernism as theorized by Jameson. Yet, despite Jameson's heroic work of clarification, postmodernism remains a hugely contested term, its meanings appropriately but unhelpfully unsettled and multiple. More importantly, I would want to argue that some of the processes with which Jameson described and analyzed have now become so aggravated and chronic that they have gone through a change in kind. Ultimately, there are three reasons that I prefer the term capitalist realism to postmodernism. In the 1980s, when Jameson first advanced his thesis about postmodernism, there were still, in name at least, political alternatives to capitalism. What we are dealing with now, however, is a deeper, far more pervasive sense of exhaustion of cultural and political sterility. In the 80s, really existing socialism still persisted, albeit in its final phase of collapse. In Britain, the fault lines of class antagonism were fully exposed in an event like the miners' strike of 1984-1985, and the defeat of the miners was an important moment in the development of capitalist realism, at least as significant in its symbolic dimension as in its practical effects. The closure of pits was defended precisely on the grounds that keeping them open was not economically realistic, and the miners were cast in the role of the last actors in a doomed proletarian romance. The 80s were the period when capitalist realism was fought for and established, when Margaret Thatcher's doctrine that there is no alternative, as succinct a slogan of capitalist realism as you could hope for, became a brutally self-fulfilling prophecy. Secondly, postmodernism involved some relationship to modernism. Jameson's work on postmodernism began with an interrogation of the idea, cherished by the likes of Adorno innovations alone. What Jameson saw happening instead was the incorporation of modernist motifs into popular culture. Suddenly, for example, surrealist techniques would appear in advertising. At the same time, as particular modernist forms were absorbed and commodified, modernist credos, its supposed belief in elitism and its monological top-down model of culture were challenged and rejected in the name of difference, diversity, and multiplicity. Capitalist realism no longer stages this kind of confrontation with modernism. On the contrary, it takes the vanquishing of modernism for granted. Modernism is now something that can periodically return, but only as a frozen aesthetic style, never as an ideal for living. Thirdly, a whole generation has passed since the collapse of the Berlin Wall. In the 1960s and 1970s, capitalism had to face the problem of how to contain and absorb energies from outside. It now, in fact, has the opposite problem. Having all too successfully incorporated externality, how can it function without an outside it can colonize and appropriate? For most people under 20 in Europe and North America, the lack of alternatives to capitalism is no longer even an issue. Capitalism seamlessly occupied the horizons of the thinkable. Jameson used to report in horror about the ways that capitalism had seeped into the very unconscious. Now, the fact that capitalism has colonized the dreaming life of the population is so taken for granted that it is no longer worthy of comment. It would be dangerous and misleading to imagine that the near past was some prelapsarian state rife with political potentials, so it's as well to remember the role that commodification played in the production of culture throughout the 20th century. Yet, the old struggle between dethronement and recuperation, between subversion and incorporation, seems to have been played out. What we are dealing with now is not the incorporation of materials that previously seemed to possess subversive potential, but instead their pre-corporation, the preemptive formatting and shaping of desire, aspirations and hopes by capitalist culture. Witness, for instance, the establishment of settled alternative or independent cultural zones which endlessly repeat older gestures of rebellion and contestation as if for the first time. Alternative and independent don't designate something outside mainstream culture. Rather, they are styles, in fact, the dominant styles within the mainstream. No one embodied and struggled with this deadlock more than Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. In his dreadful lassitude and objectless rage, Cobain seemed to give varied voice to the despondency of the generation that had come after history, whose every move was anticipated, tracked, bought and sold before it had even happened. Cobain knew that he was just another piece of spectacle, that nothing runs better on MTV than a protest against MTV, knew that his every move was a cliché scripted in advance, knew that even realizing it is a cliché. The impasse that paralyzed Cobain is precisely that one that Jameson described. Like postmodern culture in general, Cobain found himself in a world in which stylistic innovation is no longer possible, where all that is left is to imitate that style, to speak through the mask and with the voices of the styles in the imaginary museums. Here, even success meant failure, since to succeed would only mean that you were the new meat on which the system could feed. But the high existential angst of Nirvana and Cobain belongs to an older movement. What succeeded them? Was a pastiche rock which reproduced the forms of the past without anxiety. Cobain's death confirmed the defeat and incorporation of rock's utopian and Promethean ambitions. When he died, rock was already being eclipsed by hip-hop, whose global success has presupposed harassment of youth by the police. Real means the death of the social. It means corporations who respond to increased profit, not by raising pay or improving benefits, but by downsizing, the laying off the permanent workforce in order to create a floating employment pool of part-time and freelance workers without benefits or job security. In the end, it was precisely hip-hop's performance of this first version of the real, the uncompromising, that enables this its easy absorption into the second, the reality of late capitalist economic instability, where such authenticity has proven highly marketable. Gangster rap neither merely reflects pre-existing social conditions, as many of its advocates claim, nor does it simply cause those conditions, as its critics argue. Rather, the circuit whereby hip-hop and the late capitalist social field feed into each other is one of the means by which capitalist realism transforms itself into a kind of anti-mythical myth. The affinity between hip-hop and gangster movies such as Scarface, the Godfather films, Reservoir Dogs, Goodfellas, and Pulp Fiction arises from the common claim to have stripped the world of sentimental illusions and seen it for what it really is, a Hobbesian war of all against all, a system of perpetual exploitation and generalized criminality. In hip-hop, Reynolds writes, "To get real is to confront the state of nature, where dog eat dog, where you're either a winner or a loser, and where most will be losers." The same neo-noir worldview can be found in the comic books of Frank Miller and in the novels of James Ellroy. There is a kind of machismo of mythologization in Miller and Elroy's work. They pose as unflinching observers who refuse to prettify the world so that it can be fitted into the supposedly simple ethical binaries of the superhero comic and the traditional crime novel. The realism here is somehow underscored rather than undercut by their fixation on the luridly venal, even though the hyperbolic insistence on cruelty, betrayal, and savagery in both writers quickly becomes pantomimic. In his pitch Blackness, Mike Davis wrote of Elroy in 1992, "There is no light left to cast shadow and evil becomes a forensic banality. The result feels very much like the actual moral texture of the Reagan-Bush era, a supersaturation of corruption that fails any longer to outrage or even interest." Yet this very desensitization serves a function for capitalist realism. Davis hypothesized that the role of L.A. Noir might have been to endorse the emergence of Homo Reganus. We are now moving into chapter 2, and I will just have a sip of water first. actually reinforces it. Take Disney's Pixar's Wall-E, 2008. The film shows an Earth so despoiled that human beings are no longer capable of inhabiting it. We're left in no doubt that consumers, capitalism, and corporation, or rather one mega corporation, by and large, is responsible for this depredation. And when we see eventually, oh, is there a typo in the book? I'll reread the sentence. And when we eventually see the human beings in off-world exile, they are infantile and obese, interacting via screen interfaces, carried around in large motorized chairs, and supping indeterminate slops from cups. What we have here is a vision of control and communication, much as Jean Baudrillard understood it, in which subjugation no longer takes the form of a subordination to an extrinsic spectacle, but rather invites us to interact and participate. It seems that the cinema audience is itself the object of this satire, which prompted some right-wing observers to recall in disgust, condemning Disney Pixar for attacking its own audience. But this kind of irony feeds rather than challenges capitalist realism. A film like Wall-E exemplifies what Robert Fowler has called interpassivity. The film performs our anti-capitalism for us, allowing us to continue to consume with impunity. The role of capitalist ideology is not to make an explicit case for something in the way that propaganda does, but to conceal the fact that the operation of capital do not depend on any sort of subjectively assumed belief. It is impossible to conceive of fascism or Stalinism without propaganda, but capitalism can proceed perfectly well, in some ways better, without anyone making a case for it. Zizek's counsel here remains invaluable. If the concept of ideology is the classic one in which the illusion is located in knowledge, he argues, then today's society must appear post-ideological. The prevailing ideology is that of cynicism. People no longer believe in ideological truth. They do not take ideological propositions seriously. The fundamental level of ideology, however, is not of an illusion masking the real state of things, but that of an unconscious fantasy structuring our social reality itself. And at this level, we are of course far from being a post-ideological society. Cynical distance is just one way. To blind ourselves to the structural power of ideological fantasy, even if we do not take things seriously, even if we keep an ironical distance, we are still doing that. Capitalist ideology in general, Zizek maintains, consists precisely in the overvaluing of belief, in the sense of inner subjective attitude at the expense of the beliefs we exhibit and externalize in our behavior. So long as we believe in our hearts that capitalism is bad, we are free to continue to participate in capitalist exchange. According to Zizek, capitalism in general relies on the structure of disavowal. We believe that money is only a meaningless token of no intrinsic worth, yet we act as if it has a holy value. Moreover, this behavior precisely depends upon the prior disavowal. We are able to fetishize money in our action only because we have already taken an ironic distance towards money in our head. Corporate anti-capitalism wouldn't matter if it could be differentiated from an authentic anti-capitalist movement. Yet, even before its momentum was stalled by September 11 attacks on the World Trade Center, that so-called anti-capitalist movement seemed also to have conceded too much to capitalist realism. Since it was unable to posit a coherent alternative political, economical model to capitalism, the suspicion was that the actual aim was not to replace capitalism, but to mitigate its worst excesses. And since the form of its activities tended to be the staging of protest rather than political organization, there was a sense that the anti-capitalism movement consisted of making a series of hysterical demands which it didn't expect to be met. hoards them. Yet it is not capitalism but protest itself which depends upon disfiguration of the father, and one of the successes of the current global elite has been their avoidance of identification with the figure of the hoarding father, even though the reality they impose on the young is substantially harsher than the condition they protested against in the 60s. Indeed, it was of course the global elite itself, in the form of entertainers such as Richard Curtis and Bono, which organized the Live Aid event. To reclaim a real political agency means first of all accepting our insertion at the level of desire, in the remorseless meat grinder of capital. What is being disavowed in the objection of evil and ignorance onto phantasmatic others is our own complicity in planetary networks of oppression. What needs to be kept in mind is both that capitalism is a hyper-abstract impersonal structure and that it would be nothing without our cooperation. The most Gothic description of capital is also the most accurate. Capital is an abstract parasite, an insatiable vampire and zombie maker, but the living flesh it converts into that labor is ours, and the zombies it makes are us. There is a sense in which it simply is the case that the political elite are our servants. The miserable service they provide from us is to launder our libidos, to obligingly represent for us our disavowed desires, as if they had nothing to do with us. The ideological blackmail that has been in place since the original Live Aid concert in 1985 has insisted that caring individuals could end famine directly without the need for any kind of political solution or systemic reorganization. It is necessary to act straight away, we were told. Politics has to be suspended in the name of ethical immediacy. Bono's product Red Brand wanted to dispense even with the philanthropic intermediary. Philanthropy is like hippie music, holding hands, Bono proclaimed. Red is more like punk rock, hip-hop. They should feel like hard commerce. The point was not to offer an alternative to capitalism. On the contrary, products Red's punk rock or hip-hop character consisted in its realistic acceptance that capitalism is the only game in town. No, the aim was only to ensure that some of the proceeds of particular transaction went to good causes. The fantasy being that Western consumerism, far from being intrinsically implicated in systemic global inequalities, could itself solve them. All we have to do is buy the right products. So, this is the end of the first two chapters of Capitalist Realism. Pretty intense, if you ask me. I will see you soon again to continue with chapter 3 and 4. Apologies once again, I have a blocked nose and I'm hungry, so